G'day everyone, Kate Fantanell or Lady Liberty Australia here, and I have started putting together a video series looking at Australia's gun laws. Now, I worked for the Sporting Shooters Association of Australia in the national office as the media spokesperson and lobbyist for more than 5 years. I also had the honour of working for Australia's most pro gun politician we've ever had, former Senator David Leyonhjelm. And I have spent the majority of my career working as an advocate for Australia's gun owners. So I thought I would share a bit of my knowledge with my American followers and also for all of my Aussie mates back home, just having a look at exactly what kind of laws we have on the books in Australia when it comes to firearms. So I've put together a bit of a slideshow today where I will be focusing on the bane of my existence, which is appearance laws. So, what are appearance laws? What does this mean when it comes to owning firearms in Australia? I will take you on that journey today. So, firstly, hopefully, you might have already seen my video on the Port Arthur massacre. This incident in Tassie in 1996 changed the landscape of Australian gun ownership forever. We have gone backwards in terms of our rights and what we can and can't own in my home country. So, going back, just a bit of a summary for those of you who haven't seen my Port Arthur visit video yet. The After the incident in Tasmania, where 35 people were massacred by a lone gunman, Martin Bryant, the state and territory governments got together with our federal government, sat down, and came up with new gun laws. Now, it's important to note, and if you go back and look at my Port Arthur video, I explain in detail that in Australia, the federal government holds the responsibilities for regulating firearms that are imported and exported into our country, but the state and territory governments hold the powers to regulate and legislate firearms in each of the different states and territories. So we do not have national firearm laws. I know it can be confusing because they have called it National Firearms Agreement, but the key part of that sentence is agreement. The states and territories have the power still to do what they like when it comes to firearms. Uh, in 2002, there was another incident involving firearms in our beautiful country. And then this led to the governments at the time sitting down together and regulating handguns. Now, handguns have always been quite strictly controlled in Australia. We had registration for those shortly after we were federated as a country. So, this agreement here change some of the handgun laws we have. Now, in 2017, when I was working at the SSAA, the government at the time, which was the Liberal National Government, or they're meant to be a conservative government, but things have changed. They got together and merged those two documents, so the National Firearms Agreement and the Handgun Control Agreement. So they put it all into one document. And as mentioned, it is an agreement. The federal government does not have the power to tell the states what to do when it comes to firearm laws, but they are very good at offering bribes in the form of taxpayers' money to change laws as long as they get some of that federal government funding, similar to what happens here in the United States. So, in this 2017 National Firearms Agreement document, they've changed some of the wording from the original two documents. So, in this slide, this is the opening statement. The National Firearms Agreement constitutes the national approach. It affirms that firearms possession and use is a privilege that is conditional on the overriding need to ensure public safety. So, in Australia, firearms are not considered a right. We are told constantly that they are a privilege only afforded to the people that the state deems necessary. And it goes on to also talk about public safety is improved by safe and responsible possession, carriage, use, registration. So, Australia does have mandatory registration of all firearms. As I said, handguns have typically always been registered in Australia, but after 1996, when that incident in Tassie occurred, firearms registration was brought out across all the states and territories, and they are claiming here that it is part of protecting public safety. I will do a video on registration later. They also mentioned storage. Now, this is important too because we have very strict storage requirement laws in Australia, down to the level in my home state of Western Australia at the moment that brought in new requirements for those who own more than 2 handguns, that you must have a safe that measures 10 mil thick. And there's also CCTV, GPS locations of where you store your firearms. I will do a video on the storage requirements as well. So, going back to the opening statement, the agreement sets out minimum requirements, and then they've said the states and territories are welcome to include more restrictive regulations, and everyone has to have regard to the National Firearms Trafficking Policy Agreement as well, which came out of after that handgun changes. So, this is the next part, provision to maintain fundamental aspects of the National Firearms Agreement. So, the Council of Australian Governments, which is typically consists of the Premier, who is similar to the governors here in the United States, sitting down with the Prime Minister and other relevant ministers and agreeing to certain things in relation to firearms. This is what was restricted back in 1996. Obviously, they haven't given us any of our liberties back since then. So, this sets out what is banned from import into Australia. So, all semi auto long arms and pump action shotguns and all parts, including magazines for such firearms. Magazines with a capacity greater than 30 for long arms and magazines with a capacity greater than 20 for handguns. And no, that does not mean we get to own, the civilians do not get to own firearms with magazines at those capacities. Typically, it is no more than 10 magazine capacity of handguns and 10 for rifles as well. Shotguns are typically limited to 5. All handguns for sporting shooting purposes other than those which meet the prescribed characteristics, including barrel length, magazine capacity, and caliber. So, this again narrows down what we can import into our country. There are very specific requirements surrounding handguns. Magazine capacity typically 10, as I mentioned, very strict on barrel length too, nothing that can be concealed, and handgun parts for sport shooting purposes, which could be used to assemble a prohibited handgun or convert a permitted handgun into a prohibited handgun. So they've banned those items from being imported into Australia, which the federal government does have the powers to do that. This goes on to outline some of the other things that the jurisdictions had to ban, which is sale, resale, transfer, possession, manufacture, and use of semi automatic long arms and pump action shotguns, except for the military, of course, police, or other government purposes, of course, occupational categories. And this is when we get into the weeds about a certain category of person being allowed to own firearms in Australia. They do categorize firearms according to a license category. Again, if you watch my Port Arthur video, I go through this in more detail. And in Australia, a firearms license, the person goes and applies for a license depending on the category of firearm they wish to purchase, and they have to prove why they need it. I'll do another video on the licensing requirements too. So, this is what I want to talk about today. So, you will see, so category D is a category of firearm in Australia that typically only people engaged in work where they are paid to conduct a shooting or hunting activity can access and possess Category D firearms. But there is the word appearance. They cannot resemble a military firearm. And this is the worst laws in the books in Australia when it comes to firearms at a federal level. So I'll tell you a little story. When I was working for SSAA National, we started getting phone calls from some of our members in relation to a Riverman operated assisted firearm, which is pictured here. So this firearm, and this was in 2018, it was approved, people were allowed to import it. It was categorized as you could purchase it. And then people started getting these letters. So this is an official letter from the Australian Border Force. They control what comes in and what goes out of our country. And in this letter that was sent to one of the members back in 2018, it says that Customs, the bureaucrats, had recategorized that firearm so that it was no longer legal in Australia. Goes on to say that anyone who has purchased this firearm is eligible for compensation, but they must surrender it as soon as possible. And the reason for this is because the bureaucrats at Customs determined that the Riverman OAF too closely resembled the Stoner CQB Mod 2. And this is the picture that they used to justify their reason. So about 120 of these firearms had been imported into Australia at the time, and about 120 people got issued these letters. People paid about $5,000 Australian to purchase these firearms, and the cost of the buyback, which we all know it is not a buyback because the state cannot buy back something they never owned in the first place, ended up costing around $1 million of taxpayers' money to get these firearms out of the hands of people who had already purchased them legally. So, having a look at it again, the Australian government banned the Riverman OAF because it too closely resembled, in their opinion, the Stoner CQB. This is what is happening in Australia. And this is the official opinion that was written by the bureaucrats in Australian Border Force. There it is. It's substantially the same in appearance as a fully automatic firearm. So it wasn't because of the action, it wasn't because of the magazine capacity or even the caliber. It was purely because it resembled a different firearm. This is the lunacy of the laws that we have in Australia. Now, this wasn't the only case. I wish it was. But back in 2008, so a bit before my time, Heckler and Koch designed the Model R8 rifle for Australia. And in all their wisdom, the Australian government, the bureaucrats at the time, decided that it too closely resembled the G36 by H&K. So I'm not sure if you can see any similarities there, but that is their justification for why the R8 rifle was banned from being imported into Australia. Interestingly, the Australian military have used H&K 417s, but the civilian people in Australia could not buy the R8 purely because the government decided it too closely resembled the G36. Insane. Now, if you thought that was bad, let me show you this. New South Wales, Sydney, of course. New South Wales Police seized water pistol and charged a rideshare driver after he allegedly discharged replica gun near New South Wales Parliament. And that water pistol, the police deemed it to too closely resemble a Glock. And so this person was charged under firearm offences, even though he was only in possession of a water pistol. But because it looked too much like a Glock, he was charged with firearm offences. This is what's going on down under in my country. Now, back when I did work for SSAA National, and since then I've continued to look at appearance laws because, as I have said, they are the bane of my existence. And at the time, when I was working for SSAA, this is a story that I wrote when I was a journalist for the Australian Shooter magazine. A student in Tasmania wrote a really detailed academic article basically saying that these laws are ludicrous. It should not be down to a government bureaucrat to decide what people can and can't own when it comes to firearms based purely on their opinion. And his paper was called um, Judging a Book by Its Cover: The Challenges of Prohibiting Firearms by Their Appearance. And the author of this um, paper here was Samuel Adams. So I wrote a story looking at that and highlighting what he found out and his recommendations that these laws be scrapped. Now, in my home state of Western Australia, we, of course, are fighting the gun laws. I have launched legal action there. I'm challenging the state government and their current gun laws. Appearance laws did come up when the Western Australian Law Reform Commission was tasked with providing detailed information about how they think the law should work. The government has continued to ignore the recommendations from their very own Law Reform Commission. And in that document, Project 105, for those following at home, they specifically called out appearance laws and said this is not how a government should be regulating anything. You cannot ban something or restrict something based on what it looks like, based purely on appearances. So this is the Law Reform Commission has said that, the academic article before. There has been other pieces of work more broadly about regulations and what makes good regulations, what is bad regulations. And I would have to say, in all my years in politics and advocacy, that appearance laws are the worst laws on the books for the people, because you are at the whim of the bureaucrats who are appointed into those positions. It is up to them. It is for them to decide if something looks too similar in appearance, as I've shown in those examples today. It's a bit of a long bow to draw, but they will use anything they can to restrict us from owning firearms. And in Australia, because of how a gun looks, it can be banned. So thank you. This is the first video in my series looking at Australia's crazy gun laws. I'm Kate Fantanell, Lady Liberty Australia. I will be back with another video for you soon.